Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. We are excited to be launching a new series here at the RP Group where we will spotlight some of the wonderful work that is being done across our system and at different colleges and districts. And we're excited to have Moorpark College as our first college to launch this series. We're super excited. We hope that you will find the information that we share with you today, both informational and inspirational. So if we can go to the next slide. We're going to start very briefly with an overview of the African American Transfer Tipping Point study as to kind of lay some of the foundation and the connection between Moorpark's work and the RP group. And then we're going to give the time over to Moorpark to share what they've been doing in terms of supporting students who have been on what is formerly known as academic probation at their college. And then we're just going to wrap up with a kind of a shout out to statewide academic senate and the difference that they're trying to make at a system level. So let's get started. Our African American Transfer Tipping Point study is a study that we've done here at the RP Group over the last couple of years. Let's go to the next slide. Essentially, this study came out of our previous work on Through the Gate, where we were looking at students who had completed all or most of their transfer requirements. And from that study, we learned that if Black students can get to some kind of tipping point, and we didn't know where exactly it was, they became much more likely to transfer than when they started as a freshman. So we wanted to dig into, again, what are those factors that are either helping or hurting students' chances of transferring? And more specifically, what kinds of programs and practices are we witnessing on the campus, our students saying are being very helpful to them in their pursuit of transfer? Next slide, please. So our study was basically divided into three phases. We started with the extant data that all the colleges submit to the chancellor's office, looking at that MIS, as it's known, data, and seeing what we could find in that data. And then we reached out and spoke with both Black students and practitioners that support Black students, kind of sharing those findings with them and getting their take on it and their, based on their experiences, how to help us interpret what those findings might mean. And then the third phase of the study, we looked at surveying a much broader group of Black students across the whole system. And we're excited that we were able to get over 7,000 Black students to respond to that survey. Next slide, please. So in that phase one, what we learned was that completing transfer level English and math in the first year was probably the most influential factor in a Black student transferring. And again, this is comparing Black students who did the things on this list to Black students who did not. So we're comparing within the group of Black students. So over 300% increase in their chances to transfer if they're able to do English and math. But even if they're only able to do math in that first year, 160% means that their chances more than doubled, right? If they just did English, that's still a 70% increase. That's still pretty significant. I know some of the other numbers look smaller just because they're being dwarfed by that 310%. But please do not be mistaken that those factors also have a really big or play a big role in student success. Next, we have counseling. Counseling advising, if our Black students see a counselor, they're 60% more likely than Black students who do not to become transfer ready. And then shout out to my Umoja people. Students who participate in Umoja are 20% more likely than students who do not. Unfortunately, some of our students face different challenges, and those challenges make it more difficult for them to be successful. So students who basically are on financial aid, like Pell Grants and things that are need-based, those students, their chances of transferring are reduced by 20%. And again, it's not anything inherent in these students. It's not about the students, it's about the challenges. It's really hard to be successful in college when you do not have adequate resources. Similarly, for students receiving disabled student services and programs, those students, again, it's not inherent. It's not about the student, it's about the challenge that students with disabilities face in trying to be successful. And shout out to all of my DSPS colleagues. Like, I would like to think, I don't have any data on this, so this is just based on experience, but that number would probably be even higher if these students did not have access to the wonderful services and support that they receive from our DSPS colleagues. The last one there is very pronounced there in terms of students, Black students who get on academic probation at any point in time are 70% less likely to get to their transfer goal than students who never get on probation. And that is significant because while the numbers going to the right can go basically to infinity, mathematically speaking, you can be 1,000%, 10,000%. Those things are possible, but the numbers going to the left, to the negative side, can only really go up to 100% because you can't be 4 times as less likely to do something because you either do it or you don't do it. So the closer to 100%, the more significant that finding is. And the other piece of this that's important to point out, it's kind of a double whammy here, is the fact that Black students are much more likely to be put on probation in the first place. So those two factors are, interacting in a very harmful way for our students. Next slide, please. So in phase 2, we talked about were the interviews and the focus groups, and there's a lot here, but I just wanted to kind of point out how administrators, practitioners, and students don't always see things the same way. And in response to probation, what we found was practitioners saw probation as this fail-safe, right? The safety net. It's a way to intervene to get students to help them get back on track. But if you look at the language for the quote from this, there's a lot of have-tos in here that we put on these students. You have to do this, and then you have to meet with us, you have to see a counselor, you have to. And the students see academic probation very differently from basically the student said, I felt like the college gave up on me, right? It felt like I was being punished. And no one ever asked me why I got on probation in the first place. No one was actually really trying to help me figure out how I could get off probation. And then obviously just the language itself, the word probation coming from our criminal justice system. And I just recently presented this at the Emoja conference last week, and I had originally asked the question, why do we even call it probation? Like, who came up with that? Right. And then when the students, because at the Emoja conference, we're blessed to have so many students joining us at that conference and to have their voice in the room while we're talking about these things and sharing their experiences live, like they're literally living this right now. And the experiences they were describing made me realize that saying to where the system's not broken, it's working exactly the way it was intended to work. And that's why it's called probation, because it is intended to run just like the criminal justice system, to be punitive and not rehabilitative. And so it's like, oh, this is starting to make more sense. But obviously, this needs to be re-envisioned, restructured, torn down, and built back up from not from a criminal justice punitive perspective, but more from how we want you to be successful, how can we help you perspective. Next slide, please. And then finally, in our survey, we looked at, kind of the survey got to a lot of information, and we wanted to talk about how these things intersected with different factors that we have looked at in our studies. And this is where I want to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Katie Brohawn, to take us through.
Great, thanks, Darla. So as Darla mentioned, we were able to hear from over 7,000 African American and Black students from every single community college across the state. And we had a whole webinar on this last week that dives into all the different findings from that study. And we'll give you a QR code to it at the end. Hopefully some of you on this call were able to join us then. But one key piece of this is we asked students who were currently on academic probation at the time of taking the survey, how much various things were a challenge for them relative to students who had never been put on academic probation. And so what you see here are the 4 factors from the students' transfer capacity building framework, which is a part of the Through the Gate research project that the RP conducted. And what you can see here very clearly is that students who were currently on academic probation at the time of taking the survey were much more likely to indicate the challenges of each of the 4 factors. So it's university affordability, school life balance, pathway navigation, and having a support network and helping them navigate transfer. And you see especially so the difference when it comes to school life balance. So we also asked students, breaking it out by their probation status, how much various other things were a challenge for them. So we asked about mental health, challenges related to the pandemic. The survey was administered this past winter. We asked about difficulty completing transfer level courses, their access to basic needs, their access to computer tools at home, which in and of itself is a basic need, you could argue, and lack of access to helpful counselors and advisors. And again, what you can see here, students on academic probation are much more likely to identify with a whole host of challenges not related to academics that are happening in their life, which really speaks to the need to approach academic probation from a much more holistic level. And I know I keep saying academic probation because that's a language we use, and I hope that after this webinar is done, we can kind of do away with this term entirely. But we'll talk more about that later. But really what we were trying to lift up here is the fact that if you are really going to help an academically struggling student, it's not enough to provide them math tutoring services, let's say, because we do know math is going to help them get nearer through the transfer gate, but it's so much more than that. So that is just kind of a very quick snapshot of these findings from our study. But again, we encourage you to read more up on it. We'll have QR codes at the end. Here's one QR code to the first phases of the work, phases 1 and 2 that Dr. Cooper was referencing earlier. And then at the end, we'll show you a QR code for that work that I was just talking about, the survey of students across the state. But I know you are all here to hear from the Moorpark College team. And before I turn it over to them, just to share a little bit about Moorpark. So established in 1967, Moorpark is the largest community college in the Ventura County Community College District. They have more than 13,000 students each semester. And their mission is to empower learners from local, national, and global backgrounds to achieve their certificate, associate's, and baccalaureate degree, and transfer in career and educational goals. The institution is guided by a student-first philosophy that embraces equity, social justice, anti-racism, and intersectionality. And I think that RP can really resonate with that mission and that vision. And the college integrates its programs with innovative construction and holistic student supports. Moorpark ranks first among California community colleges for its 78% transfer rate to 4 years. And inspired by Cal State Fullerton, the college, and this is what we're talking about today, or they're talking about today, the college recently rebranded the term academic probation as academic notice. And so we were just really thrilled when the Moorpark team reached out to us and was sharing what they were doing, because this just aligns so much with the work that we're doing with the African American Transfer Tipping Point Project. And anytime we see research being turnkeyed into action, it just makes our hearts sing. So I want to turn it over to the Moorpark team. I'm going to stop share so that they can share.
Thank you so much, Katie and Darla. Hello, everybody. My name is Oleg Bespalov. I'm the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness, Pace, and Marketing at Moorpark College. I have with me a fantastic team that was involved in this work. We have Dave Anter, who's our registrar, Jodi Dickey, who is chair of our counseling department and also recently became our interim dean, Angela LaFave, who's a researcher here, Cassandra Marcum, who's a counseling services specialist, and Jamie, who is our communication consultant, public information officer, as well as a full-time faculty member in our communications department. So I think as Darla and Katie masterfully went over earlier, we have a serious issue in higher education with academic probation. I think the data they provided earlier makes it pretty clear that the term academic probation is clearly associated with the criminal justice system. And what makes this tragic, based on the data they provided earlier, is that us as colleges really thought academic probation was meant to help students. You know, many of us do believe that the work that we're doing is try to make it as accessible and easy for students to get back on the path. But unfortunately, you know, as they shared with their recent findings, that's not what students perceive when they get onto academic probation. And as a result of that, that perception for the students results in long-term negative impacts. The negative impacts for the students, next slide, please. The negative impacts for the students come out in all sorts of ways, but most direct is the impact in their persistence towards graduation. So there is a variety of different data sources, and some of them vary, but they all basically amount to the same thing, which is many students are impacted by academic probation, and the ones who end up on academic probation are less likely to graduate. So some of the sample data out there includes the data that RP Group covered earlier, as well as a 2016 study from CCRC showing 20% of all undergraduates are placed on probation each year, which means millions of students in higher education. Another study showing 8% of students who graduate reporting having been placed on academic probation, meaning it impacts even students who graduate. And then a longitudinal study of students enrolled at community college indicating that as few as 13% of students placed on academic probation eventually graduate. For my fellow researchers on the call, there's even studies that are causality related, not just correlation related, showing that students just above and below the threshold have significant differences in their outcomes, meaning if they're, you know, if they just made it above the threshold and ended up on academic probation, they end up faring a lot worse than those students who just missed the cutoff. And compounding, you know, you're seeing all the negative effects of academic probation and student success. You also see it appear in terms of ramifications for their students' mental health. And to talk about the implications on their mental health, I'm going to turn it over to Jodi.
Thank you, Oleg. Well, let me back up for one moment. There is a significant body of research that's dedicated to the qualitative assessment of academic probation's impact on students' experience in higher ed. In Academic Deficiencies, Student Experience of Institutional Labeling, published in the Journal of the First Year Experience in Students in Transition in 2015, students reported significant negative impacts to their mental health after being placed on academic probation. They felt blindsided, embarrassed, and they felt like they were a failure. In 2021, the College Transition Collaborative created a word cloud. Please go to the next slide. That captures the feedback students provided on their emotional experiences surrounding academic probation. Some standout quotes from this research include, "I feel like a failure," and the vague and personal language of the letter from some authority figure I had never met didn't help me at all. I felt like I was the only person who had ever become weak like this. I didn't tell anyone because I was ashamed. Being on probation sucked. For some time after getting the letter, I felt that I didn't belong. I had already felt that way coming in, but the letter seemed to confirm that. I wanted to drop out. As a counselor, I've witnessed firsthand the impact academic probation can have on a student's self-esteem and sense of belonging at our institution. When meeting with many of them, our students referenced the letter they received, notifying them of their change in academic standing. The impersonal language paired with the connotations surrounding the term probation left many of them feeling like they had been coldly rejected by our institution and labeled as a failure. You know, many students find out about their academic status as well when they're trying to enroll in classes. They'll go to drop in if they fail to see the letter and see why there's a hold. It's there, they're told they're on probation. And then they're also told of all the hoops they're going to now need to go through. And because of the word probation, students often react and don't see counselors in the moment that they're there to help them. And that interferes with the whole concept of supporting our students when they're struggling academically. Further, students would often come to appointments with a sense they were in trouble, needed to negotiate to be allowed to remain in school. And most importantly, as referenced by Oleg, they're anxious and they're distressed. And these are students who are already struggling because of external factors. And we're compounding that sense of, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna be able to attend school. Now what? So while we had taken many steps to improving student support resources that we provide students once they're placed on academic probation, this feedback left us wondering if we could improve our communication surrounding academic probation policies and reduce the stigma and discouragement our students felt. And then I believe I am going to pass this over to Jamie. Am I correct on that?
Thank you, Jodi. So what can we do? I think that for most of us, the concept of how academic probation as a system, as a kind of element of stigmatization of academic challenges, we're all very aware that this is impactful for students. I think some of this research for us might just really illuminate how impactful it is. And some of you right now might be feeling how many of us at Moorpark College felt, which is this feeling that this is a huge issue. I don't really know, what we can do about it in the interim. This feels like something that needs to be addressed statewide. This feels like a legislation change, and it is. And that's something that we're going to be addressing in our presentation. But, we really took it upon ourselves at Moorpark College to say, well, what can we do right now? What can we do right now to improve the climate surrounding academic probation on our campus and, create sort of some interim solutions for what has to be a much larger scale policy change. So as Jodi mentioned, the first thing that we did that I think a lot of you have been doing, the thing that has the most, face validity is increased supports for students on academic probation. And this is something that likely many of you are involved in at your campuses. But as Jodi said, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper. And so the second thing we really looked at was reframing the language surrounding academic probation on our campus, and also improving the communication surrounding academic probation. In terms of the reframing, I think it's, a lot of us talk about what it has, associations with the criminal justice system, or I think that if you dig even deeper into that, you can really think about this association with power structure, historical power structures in which higher education institutions have been gatekeepers of access to resources and the benefits that come with a higher education, and historically served as gatekeepers and barriers for disproportionately impacted communities, marginalized communities, et cetera. And so I think that if we zoom out even larger, this framing of probation really does reinforce those power structures of, a student being beholden to an institution that has power over them and gets to determine whether or not they have access to these resources. And so this was something we really wanted to deconstruct and dig a little bit deeper into. And also in terms of communication, we were inspired by this concept that Gloria Crisp in her book, Mentoring at-Risk Students Through the Hidden Curriculum of Higher Education, this concept of how academic probation relates to the hidden curriculum. I think for many of us, when we think about things related to the hidden curriculum, we're thinking about, study skills, navigating graduation pathways, things like that. But it was really enlightening for us to frame it in this way, that academic probation in and of itself, its significance in your academic career, how to navigate the appropriate channels to restoring academic standing, is definitely part of the hidden curriculum. And when we look at trends, we see that disproportionately impacted students are more likely to suffer from lack of access to educational capital related to the hidden curriculum. And we also see students, disproportionately impacted students, more likely to be impacted by academic probation. And so we really saw this connection as an opportunity to kind of holistically look at this as an opportunity to eradicate some of the elements of this hidden curriculum when it comes to having good academic standing, facing academic challenges, et cetera. So when it comes to our experimental design, the very first thing we looked at was, as Jodi mentioned, the letter, reframing the letter, and not just the letter, but the culture and the terminology used when describing this academic standing. And so for us, that involved reframing academic probation as academic notice. This was no longer framed as something punitive, being on probation, or, a period of turmoil, if you will, a period in which you're subject to restrictions. Instead, this is a notice. This is a notice to students that we can see that you're struggling, and here we are to provide support. That really leads into the second element of our revisions, which is recontextualizing this intervention as an outreach effort, as opposed to a punitive effort or a notice of some sort of punitive status. We really wanted to recontextualize this as a check-in with a student, saying, hey, we can see that you're struggling. This is the opportunity for us to step in and provide you with the resources that you need to succeed. And then finally, a restructuring of the letter, just in terms of its accessibility and readability and transparency of the steps needed to restore academic standing. We were really inspired by California State University Fullerton that did a similar initiative with their letter. You can see the criteria that they used in their revisions of their letter, which involved framing probation as a process of learning and growth, communicating that it's not uncommon, that this isn't an uncommon struggle for students, acknowledging a variety of non-pejorative reasons for academic difficulty, acknowledging that this is not a moral failure of the student, offering hope for returning to good standing. We modeled our revisions based off of this framework of using what they coined as, psychologically attuned language revisions for their letter. But another element that we added is increasing the transparency surrounding the process to, really support this effort to eradicate elements of the hidden curriculum related to academic probation. And you can see Cal State Fullerton had some really remarkable data as a result of their letter change. If you look at students who received the psychologically attuned letter were less likely to report feeling anxious or ashamed after receiving the letter, and they were more likely to report feeling motivated, feeling respected by their institution because of this outreach of support, as opposed to a notification of a punitive status. You can also see that the letter even affected behaviors in terms of seeking tutoring or reaching out to your professor, and even curbed some behaviors that might not be as productive, like skipping class or, even considering dropping out, which is obviously a very high stakes behavior when we're talking about student success. So when it comes to the revisions for our letter, visually, when I talk about restructuring, you can see our previous letter here on the left-hand side, what I like to refer to as a very scary wall of text, in comparison to the revised version on the right-hand side, much more streamlined and clear and visually friendly to, really increase the accessibility. We also modified a lot of the language, not just to be psychologically attuned, but frankly, to just be more reader-friendly, student-friendly. We found that our old letter contained a lot of jargon and a lot of things that for a student lacking educational capital, or frankly, any student early on in their educational career, would be very overwhelming and confusing. I'll just very briefly go over a couple of the major changes that we made to our letter. The first being the opening of the letter. Our previous letter started very blunt. According to your current college records, your academic status is academic probation, just right there. As you can see in the revised version of the letter, this is an affirmation of us helping them succeed, telling them that when you face academic challenges, this is when the college steps in and supports you. So you can really see the use of language language and the use of framing to recontextualize this communication as an offer of support, as opposed to some sort of punitive measure. You can also see in the second paragraph there on the right, it's kind of a more detailed explanation of the causation behind getting this academic standing, as opposed to just flat out labeling a student. It's giving an explanation of how they've reached this point. And then for the second element here, you can just see that in our previous letter, right after the announcement of the status was really just an outline of, frankly, all of the bad things that will happen to you. If you do not fix your academic standing, you'll be subject to academic dismissal. Here are the following negative effects. As you can imagine, any student reading this would feel very overwhelmed. All of those associations that you saw in the word cloud research that we referenced, feeling ashamed, embarrassed, anxious. I think that this was really a wake up for us, looking at our letter after examining that research and seeing the ways in which we were contributing to those kinds of reactions from students. And so you can see on the right-hand side, just a complete 180. This is not a punishment. It's an opportunity to receive the kinds of support that you need. We're going to help you by providing you with this program, and by participating in this program, it'll help you get back on track to restore academic standing. So it really is just kind of a revolutionized version of this communication for us at our campus. The second part of our experimental design was related to outreach efforts. I don't know about any of you, but on our campus, our email engagement rates are pretty abysmal. And so, as Jodi mentioned, many students didn't even find out about their new academic status until they tried to sign up for classes, or they went to drop in to get advice on what math class to take. And all of a sudden they find out that they're going to have some barriers to registering for classes next semester. And we really wanted to avoid that. And we also really wanted to lean into this idea of having an opportunity to provide emotional support and guidance in this pivotal moment in a student's career. And so Moorpark College over the last 2 years has been investing in creating an infrastructure for two-way text message communication in the majority of our student services departments now, where we are replacing traditional outreach through email or through phone call with two-way text message. And we've seen a lot of really incredible results and, input from our students that this is something they really value. And so we saw this as an opportunity to reach out to students that had this change in their academic standing, notify them of the change, provide support, and most importantly, serve as that warm handoff to connect them with whatever resources they might need. So I will be handing things over to Drew, who will be detailing the results of these two interventions.
Thank you, Jamie. So the data suggests that revising the probation letter with psychologically attuned language, which includes changing probation to academic notice, leads to an increase in persistence by 4.5 percentage points, as well as closing persistence gaps between white and Hispanic students. During the same time frame, students who did not receive probation or academic notice letters, that's students who are in good academic standing, had nearly identical persistence rates. That's 81.8 in 2022 versus 82.1 in 2023, about the same. This suggests the year-over-year increase in persistence between the probation group and the academic notice group were not impacted by confounding variables, since students in good standing had similar persistence rates for both groups. And so here also, for the other study here, comparing rates between students on dismissal who received phone calls and emails versus those who got texts. Here, the data suggests adding two-way text messaging as a communication method to reach students on dismissal leads to an increase in persistence by 9 percentage points, as well as closes persistent gaps between white and Hispanic students. This data builds upon other recent studies that we've done at Moorpark that have found that two-way texting is a really efficient and effective way to communicate with students at key parts in their academic journey, and which helps them select classes for the next semester. So I think it's important here, whenever you're talking about data, to acknowledge here that these figures are not, they did not meet the threshold for statistical significance. But that is mostly due to the fact that the sample wasn't big enough. Our student body just isn't big enough to give us the power that we need to make statistical significance calculations. But these are still pretty impactful results. Even though we haven't been able to show significance, the change in persistence suggests students are individually impacted by the change. And it's a big enough change that I think if students are experiencing this themselves, whether it's statistically significant or not, it makes a big difference for the people. And we would love to collaborate with anybody else who's out there to get the sample size be bigger, so we can look at this from a statistical perspective and really get that demonstrated, because we really believe in these results. And I think I am handing it over to Dave.
Thank you, Drew. I appreciate it. Registrar at Moorpark College. So probably one of the gatekeepers. As custodian of record, I recognize that the probation statuses we were putting out term after term after term were having an impact. And we are so blessed to work in a 3-college district, which necessitates dialogue and communication. The registrars amongst these 3 colleges certainly operate on a consensus model. We know that we want to speak with one voice around the policies and procedures and whatnot. And this came up in the context of participatory governance. So many of the folks that are on the call here now are presenting were part of our District Council on Student Services and had a chance to dialogue over the change in the probation status to academic notice. And I guess I just want to point out, and it was already pointed out, that many of the students, this is their first engagement with academic standing, because they don't all read the catalog we work so hard to put together. But with that, we wanted to make sure that notice was useful to them. And I will admit I did not write the original letter that Jamie went through. Happy to report that. It came down to us from history for many years in the past, probably the early 2000s. So the change process was very simple on our end. Once agreement was achieved district-wide that this was going to happen, we started a process to craft new language. And lucky for us, we had Jamie involved as our communications officer to help us with that language and work that out. So what I can report is, we've had a lot of great collaboration, and not least of which is our excellent IT team. They were able to take our request for revised notices, and because we're all working together, it was very simple for them to make the updates that were necessary to get the right language out to students. So super excited at all the collaboration, looking forward to more. And I really want to ask, probation is one thing, notice is important, giving notice of the potential for dismissal. Well, what about dismissal? I can't think of a more unfriendly term. So I'm hoping we can take it farther in the future. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cassandra Marcum.
Thank you, Dave. I'm glad you ended on the note of dismissal, because that kind of brings me into my part of this. So Cassie Marcum, Counseling Services Specialist in the Counseling Department, classified professional. So as Jamie talked about earlier, we were doing two-way text messaging implementation, which in the counseling department hadn't been done yet before our efforts for academic notice or dismissal students. So in the past, I had, just as Jamie referenced as well, pulled a report of emails and kind of sifted through and tried to get in touch with these students, because as Jodi mentioned as well, many of them had no clue that this was even going to be a barrier. So to try to head that off, we would do it through email. And as everyone kind of has mentioned in this presentation, there's just a lot to it, back and forth. And historically, this is a population of students that you may not have an easy time getting a hold of. So when the two-way text messaging technology came to the campus and other departments were using it, I sought out my colleagues and said, how do we do this? And maybe this is something that we can start with. It was a small enough population. Now, hopefully, we can do it with larger populations to get greater amounts of data. And that's kind of how it all started. So for me, starting with the first bullet point, staffing and scheduling, it really is not as massive as you might imagine. We did this campaign with academic notice or dismissal, as we had called them before, students, with myself and 2 of my colleagues, counseling services specialists, all classified professionals. We were trained and had accounts linked to our texting technology. It was a day to get set up, and then 1 training session, and it's super simple to understand. It was super simple to use. Jamie was instrumental in helping us train and all of that great stuff. So that didn't take long at all. And then what we did was we identified how many students we would want to message at a time to make it manageable. Because once you send that text out, it might seem slow at first, but it does start to come in quickly. And so we identified the days that would work best, blocks of time. I believe we did 2 hours, and then how many students at a time. I think we might have done 30 to 50. And then that made it manageable for us to answer these texts as they were coming in. And it was so easy to do. Really, once you've done it once, it's like super simple. So we did pick blocks. So you have to be strategic too. So depending on what your campaign is. So in this instance, we definitely wanted to pick blocks of time during the day where we knew we would get the highest response rate. Too late in the day, if the student is busy or has family or work, they may not be able to answer. And then too early in the day, they may be busy with the morning, whatever life circumstances they're dealing with. So we kind of did a sweet spot right in the middle. Then after that, like we mentioned earlier, some of these students weren't aware after we texted them that they were going to have a barrier coming up. So they were very, very grateful in their responses. Like, I had no idea this was going to be a thing, and your registration date is coming. And we want to make sure we handle this before that comes up. So for staffing and scheduling, it was really easy to do. It did not take a ton of time. We could have even done it maybe with less staff. It all depends on the population of the school, of course, and then the population or the group that you're dealing with, the number of people. So then moving down to the communication strategy, it was very conversational. Jamie, again, was instrumental in helping us come up with a very succinct and concise text to send out. It was very, hi, this is Cassie from Moorpark College. We didn't want it to sound stuffy at all, or even formal, I might say, because you, like we referenced earlier, you don't want students to be fearful or afraid to reach back out to you. So it was very, very conversational, not lengthy at all. And again, this is historically a difficult population to get a hold of. So when we started sending out the text messages, the response we were getting, as opposed to when we would phone call and leave messages or email and not get responses back, it was just vastly different. It was day and night, and the responses were all so grateful. And I'm so glad you reached out to me. And then let's open the conversation. It wasn't at all like fearful or anything. They were happy to go back and forth. So it was great. The other really great thing that came out of this that was expected, but also not, is that because the staff that we use, counseling services specialists, we were all very aware of the policies, very aware of how to handle the policies, and we could also answer subsequent counseling questions, as well as having access to our counselors' schedules and the ability to make appointments. So you do need to have your staff that are working on this, maybe have the knowledge base to definitely answer follow-up questions, because we did receive those questions, just simple things like, maybe an EW process question, or I've been meaning to change my major, how can I do that? Or next semester I was planning to register for math, but I'm not sure which one that is for my major. And it was really nice that we could just answer those questions quickly, along with helping with this process as well. So that was really helpful. And then as far as communication at the end of it, we did make sure we would set up these blocks of time. So if a student responded after the time was over, they would receive just an automated message, but we all made sure we had to go back in and double check, because we didn't want to leave it open-ended. So we definitely closed the conversation, with a follow-up or close the loop. And then if we still weren't able to connect to end the conversation, there was an email sent on a follow-up, just to make sure that we weren't leaving anyone hanging on the other end, or maybe if they forgot to respond, just to make sure that we were still here, looking out for them. And then the last thing, the data tracking. So like we all kind of mentioned already, in comparison to other methods of talking to students, helping students, you know, through this process, the two-way texting has really been so efficient, so simple, so easy to use. I think students really appreciate it. I know I do. When I can do like a text thing, I find it really easy and simple and easy to use. So it definitely resulted in more efficacy at the end of the day than the emails and phone calls that we've historically done. The other thing we could track, which was great too, is that we would make students appointments with a counselor, which is nice because sometimes, depending on the college campus and how things are run, it can be difficult to get an appointment, especially if you're finding out about something you didn't know about, as if they walked in to drop in counseling and didn't realize there was a barrier there. Getting an appointment can sometimes be difficult. So luckily, using this, we were able to get the students the appointments they needed right then and there, which was nice. So it was almost like a fast track for them. But we could track after the fact. We made the appointment. Did the student attend the appointment? Was a petition submitted to increase their units? Did they register for the classes that the amount of units they asked for? And then an even longer version of tracking that data is, were they successful in the classes that they registered for? So just based on this one campaign, there's so much data we could collect afterwards to find the success rates of all of these data points, which was great. Yeah, other than that, I would say if you're thinking about implementing this on your campus, don't be afraid. It's actually really, really great. And that's all I have. So I think I'm handing it back over to, I believe, Oleg.
Thank you, Cassie. And thank you for the whole team. So my hope is through a preponderance of evidence here, we've convinced you that academic probation as it exists now needs to change, and that we have the power to change it. So the next question is, what can we all do at our own campuses based on the evidence that was presented today? Well, the first thing we can do is we can advocate for statewide policy change. RP group folks are going to discuss this later today, but there is a ASCCC resolution to overhaul the Title V language and probation, including a name change and updating the language and process to be asset-minded, not punitive, certainly being in support of that. And the hope is that this resolution will then lead to legislative change so that we can eliminate the use of the word probation altogether. We also, on a parallel path, I'm happy to say the legislator has taken action on one part of the negative impact of academic probation, which is that amongst all our different colleges, folks may or may not realize we have a variance in the appeals process for students who have who end up on academic probation about their ability to go back onto financial aid. And so AB 7789 has passed is a law that requires colleges to set a set standard so that no particular college could be more harsh than another in the way we penalize students, which is great. The next half of that, of course, is advocating to remove the word probation and change it to academic notice or something like that. But that's the big picture, right? Making the statewide legislative change. But, you know, think globally, act locally. You can make this change yourself at your campus. Part of the reason of bringing this team together is because this is exactly the kind of team you would need at your campus. Counseling, the registrar, communication folks, a small team, but an A team. But the great news about it is it doesn't really cost anything. And really, you can get the change done, I don't know, in a month, something like that. A few committees, district-wide and campus-wide, you know, a few folks to program in the letter, take some time to rewrite it, and then it's done. Before you know it, you could get this off the ground before your next wave of letters go out, I think in January for a lot of colleges. So that's our pitch for you today. You know, think globally, you know, hope for better legislation, advocate for better legislation, but act locally, make the changes within your own campus. Next slide, please. So many thanks to everybody who attended. Later on, we will have a few closing remarks from the RP group, but at this time, we wanted to take a moment to address the Q&A. I know there's a few Q&A in the chat. If my colleagues can go back on camera, we'd be happy to tackle that Q&A as well as any questions we have from our wonderful facilitators from the RP group. And then Darla or Katie, let us know if you want us to tackle the Q&A first or questions from y'all.
Yeah, why don't you guys work on the Q&A, and then we're itching to ask a couple questions ourselves.
Yeah, that sounds great. So Ruby asks, we made changes to our letter, collaborate with A&R to facilitate a campaign. A couple other things. Our current struggles are getting a hold of students and students encountering the cycle of probation. For those texting, who monitors text and software, and what servers are you using? So, I suppose, Jamie and Cassie, if you want to answer that.
I can go ahead and speak to the kind of logistics of it. So 2 years ago, I was brought on as a communication consultant for institutional research with the goal of improving our communication with students, right? As I mentioned in our presentation, we had very, very low engagement rates for email and other traditional forms of communication. And we were really seeing the negative impacts of that. I will always to this day remember the fact that we had, HERF aid available for students, $1,000, right, that students could get for free. And at the end of that process, we surveyed students, and something like 70% of them said they didn't even know it was available. Just because they were not checking their emails were inundated with so many communications from instructors due to the transition to online learning, whatever it was, we said something needs to change. And so that's where we kind of embarked on what has been a 2-year process to implement the use of two-way text message outreach for some of these really crucial things like registration, academic standing, financial aid, some of these really, crucial elements of a student's time in education, but also things that require more high-touch support. And so we invested in a two-way text message software. I saw another question in the chat. We use simple texting. It is very cost efficient. It is probably one of the cheapest outreach resources that you could pay for. And it's been, a labor of love over the last 2 years, kind of setting up an infrastructure for this in each of our student services departments. But for academic counseling, I can have Cassie or Jodi speak to the usage, but I know that we've been able to use it for things like registration, academic standing, et cetera. So really, to answer your question, we would have been in the same boat if we hadn't just, lucky coincidence, been in kind of the early stages of piloting this new software. And this was one of the first opportunities that we saw, thanks to Cassie and Jodi reaching out to us to really test this as a outreach method for students in this standing. So I'll hand this over to Jodi or Cassie if there's anything they want to add from an academic counseling perspective.
Yeah, I saw, oh, thanks. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I saw part of the question. It said something about the cycle, and it prompted. So before, what I would do is kind of knowing that this barrier was coming up and knowing students most likely had no idea, as Jamie mentioned, because of the email inundation. Twice a year, I would run a report right before spring registration would come, and then right before fall registration would come, knowing these students would most likely show up and not be able to register. So we'd run this report, and I always would focus on the dismissal students because they wouldn't be able to register for anything. And so we definitely didn't want that. And it was a more manageable group. And then we would sift out the students who had already seen someone on drop-in or kind of took it upon themselves to have an appointment. We didn't want to do double duty, of course, and reach out. And then that kind of became our population to reach out to. So I think we did this one. It was a smaller group because when we did it for the very first time, it was right before spring registration, which is a smaller grouping anyway. And that's this, as far as the cycle goes, that's where I would come in and try to head it off as best I could. I don't know if Jodi has anything more to add to that as far as counseling.
I'll just comment on the software. We are now transcending just doing two-way text campaigns, and we are shortly going to implement a text hotline as well. And so we just trained all of our counselors. It was not hard to train them. They had about an hour of training, and then with Jamie and her assistant Victoria's assistance, we were able to have people basically just jump right on and get going. And then they quickly found that the software was very similar to texting on your phone. And you know, you can make it very user-friendly with you know, emojis and all kinds of fun little things in that way, which humanizes us to our students. So it doesn't just come across as more of that language that we're discussing right now. So I would just say that it's a pretty easy software to use, and the response from students is more immediate, and we're able to respond to them more immediately. And they don't have to wait in a line. They don't have to wait for an appointment. They get their needs met when they need their needs met. And I think that's the important part of this process.
Thank you, team. The next question I have is, do you use Starfish in your campus? If so, how do you utilize it with probation/dismissal? Jodi or Dave?
I'll take that one. We do have Starfish. We have a portion of the program. We have the scheduling feature, and we have early alert. And we utilize it for early alert, and we have a whole triaging process that's set in place for that. We don't use it for our academic notice and dismissal students, because we're in a 3-campus district, and it's very difficult for us to manage the program, and it's difficult for us to manage the students within it. So we find that the progress surveys that get sent out for early alert, we can do that pretty easily, but we have found that this is way more effective in terms of our academic notice.
Thanks, Jodi. I think the next question is for Dave. What about this? What about how this appears in the official transcripts and how transferring institutions accept that language, etc.? Will this change reach Title V language?
We're super happy to report that none of our academic standing content makes it to an official transcript, because we feel that's internal information intended for our advisors, counselors, and certainly for the students. So the students will see that information elsewhere, but not on official transcripts. And
with regards to will this change reach Title V language? Well, we hope so. That's what we're advocating for, is to get that change in Title V as well.
It feels contradictory to make a change like this and not have the support of Title V, to leave that out there. But we felt very clearly that academic notice covers the meaning of academic probation. And if anyone would like to have this conversation with us, we're happy to answer those questions and share with them our intention and the sort of authentic approach we're trying to take with our students.
Thanks, Dave. Next question is, how many dedicated staff and faculty are involved with hands-on interventions like outreach, communication, appointments, support groups, interdepartment handoff, referrals? Anybody in the team, welcome to answer that.
At least 10 to 20 different individuals at different points, covering shifts and covering bases.
If this question is related to specifically how we implement the text message outreach, I can say that this is something that thankfully, due to the nature of the communication, is very flexible. right? So some of what Jodi was talking about, we're now doing larger scale campaigns, right? Where we had probably, we trained dozens of counselors. We have, we're contacting batches of thousands of students over several days, things like that. But when we first started implementing this on our campus, there wasn't a ton of buy-in, right? It was a brand new thing. We were still looking for, kind of getting this off the ground. And so I think the really beautiful thing is that we were able to make such an impact with our students with, as Cassie said, 3 people, right? It was 3 people and a texting software. That's kind of the beauty of text message. If you've got a list of several hundred students, if you're using a traditional form of outreach, that's a lot of time. If you're making hundreds of calls, any of you who have any experience in phone banks or things like that, that's a month's worth of work. Whereas with simple texting, the way that it works, it kind of works like a group message on your phone, so to speak, in the sense that you're texting multiple students at a time. However, it's not a group message in the sense that, 50 students are all on the same thread, so to speak. To them, it looks like an individual message, and we communicate with them individually, but we're able to send them out depending on the type of communication or the anticipated response rate. I think Cassie mentioned this. I think for this campaign, we were sending them out in batches of 30 students, right? And so if you send a message out to 30 students, if you get a 10 or a 20 or even 30% response rate, it's a really manageable amount of responses. And so then you can keep adding on. And so whenever we do projects like these, it's not a question of, do we have the staffing to do this? It's a question of, how do we use the staffing we have to do this? And so, we've had projects where, despite the fact that we have 3,000 students to contact, we've got 3 people. So what does that look like? It looks like spreading it out over a couple days and things like that, versus if we had a team of 10 or 20. So I completely understand the question if it was related to text message, and it's something that we definitely, I don't want to say we struggled to navigate it at first, but it's something that once you get the hang of it, you realize kind of how versatile this resource is.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to group the next a question from Loris together with Ruby's question. So Ruby and Loris, but I'll just read Ruby's question, ask, would you please share the exact text message language that was sent for the academic notice and dismissal? Does anybody have that handy? If not, I can switch to a different question and come back to it.
I'm trying to pull it up right now. So if you could switch for 1 second, I'll hopefully be able to find it.
Sounds good. Well, let's tackle a different one in the meantime. So we're going to tackle this question from Alberto. We've been really interested in changing the language at my campus. I see academic probation on Title V and felt like it was not possible. After you get people together, what were some of the important steps you took to make the language change? Also, as a follow-up, I'm assuming we would talk together as a team to a term and to agree with it. Is academic notice the only word, or is it up to the college? Thank you. So I can answer part of that question. Before we set out on this journey, I did email the state chancellor's office to make sure that we had some flexibility of this, especially with Title V language. The exact email I got back, I won't read you the whole thing, but is, and I quote, "There is no set requirement as to what language is used or what information is provided to a student in a notification letter. It is a local decision. However, the college still needs to follow Title V, Section 55034 regarding the publication of the district's probation dismissal policies and procedures and orders for students to reference. And, we have the related Title V. So part of the reason we're advocating for legislative change here today is that if you go through the Moorpark College catalog, you'll still see the word probation in there, and we couldn't change it because it's part of our board policy, which flows down from Ed Code. Fortunately for us, I think folks mentioned here earlier, students don't really read the catalog. They're not going to go sifting through page 475 to find the word probation. The first time they really encounter it is when they get that letter. And so we've been able to minimize the impact, right? But still, we would love to be able to close that loop. And also, the question that was asked, I'm sure a lot of colleges would have had the same feeling and may have also not taken that step as a result of that. So I hope I answered part of that question. Would anybody from my team like to jump in for any other part of that question I may have missed?
I think I could maybe add to that. In terms of steps, this started with Oleg sending me some of the research, and we went to a district committee, our district council on student services, and we presented to them the idea of changing the language and why, and we presented the research. And to be honest, the buy-in was so quick. And in that committee, you have deans from all campuses, you have registrars from all the campuses, you have counseling faculty, you have academic senate presidents, instructional faculty. And I think that because they're all there from the student services perspective, they're all there wanting to help and support students. And so we didn't have to strong arm anything. It seemed logical, I think, and the buy-in was actually very quick. I think we might have taken it to one more work group outside of DCSS. I think we might have taken it to a work group that's actually been disbanded, but it really was a very quick process. So you have to know your own institution, I suppose, and you have to know what particular barriers you might have within your own institution, and just be prepared to address any questions that there might be. But I think I would hope that it would be as easy as we actually found it to be.
Right.
Thanks, Jodi. Okay, and then also thank you, Jamie. I think hopefully folks see that she posted the specific text message in the chat. Jamie, do you want to provide a little bit more context for the vision for how we wrote that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this addresses another question that there was about what kind of information is in that form of outreach for us, and frankly, for any campaign that we're doing with any student services department, the first question is, what's the goal? What's the goal of the communication? And so when we met with academic counseling, they communicated that, we really just, if we could get these students in for an appointment, then we could not only provide them with maybe the emotional support that they didn't get initially, or the support that they need right now because they're at this kind of pivotal juncture in their academic career, but we can connect them with services, whether that's, and also, make sure that they're completing any requirements, whether it's a form they need to fill out or some sort of, I know many of us have, Canvas courses or things like that for students who get placed on academic notice. And so for us, the primary goal was first to make sure that these students were aware of the change in their status, just because, as many of us have expressed, sometimes students are unaware. Second, to hopefully, you can see kind of the language and the vibe of the communication, so to speak, really communicate that we're still a source of support and that it's not something that they should be ashamed of. And then finally, getting them in for an appointment. For us, it was the exigence too of registration. We were reaching out because it was nearing the end of the semester and we needed them to come in, to make whatever changes or fill out whatever they needed to do in order to be able to persist to the next semester. And so really for us, it's always just, what is the goal? Keep things as short and sweet as possible, but also, depending on the context of the communication, or I would say, frankly, for the majority of our communications, right, it's that warm conversational tone that we're really aiming for, to really capture that, it's almost the digital version of a warm handoff, or pulling a student aside and saying, hey, I'm here, and I'm literally right here because of the immediacy of the communication platform. I think that that's the other thing too. One of the reasons we get such high engagement is because text message is so much more personal and immediate than an email, that it really does feel like probably as close as you could get to in-person support as possible. I think that was... Yeah, so that's our draft for we did this for academic dismissal.
Thank you, Jamie. Next question, I think, is for Jodi. Other than the counseling department, do your other departments like care, financial aid, admissions, and tutoring have a significant role, or does the majority of accountability land on counselors, I think, in relation to probation and dismissal?
I'm not sure if this is in reference to managing the texting and the notification. A&R sends out the letter, so we don't have to worry about that part. As you've heard, the counseling department and primarily our counseling services specialists have managed the outreach via text. Certainly financial aid has a role in in student standing, but it's also related to the financial aid rules, which are slightly different, as I'm sure you're aware, than ours are. So really, it's just been our area that has worked on this with the support of Jamie and her team, Oleg, and his team. So really, it's been very manageable within our area. Did I leave anything out, Cassie? Can you think of anybody else that's really involved?
No, it was mostly, classified staff, as Jodi mentioned, and then meeting with the counselor. And then the petition itself does go to admissions and records. And so their staff is helping us by giving those students opening the gate and giving them the increase in units they need to register. So it gets sent digitally, thank goodness, not a paper form anymore, thanks to Dave. So that actually, takes down a barrier too, is digitizing a lot of our forms, and it happens a lot quicker than it used to. So no, but I think that's it.
Thank you. The next question is from Mitra. Are there considerations you've experienced along the way in this research and fabulous work that looks at how faculty grade to begin with, thinking of questions like how students get on academic notice to begin with and how revolutionizing assessment well before conversations of academic progress need to be had? Well, we only have 15 minutes left in the webinar, so I won't go into depth. But of course, I think all colleges are working towards that, right? Towards that goal. The thing that's also critical is that students can end up on academic probation because life gets in the way, right? So regardless of assessment changes you make locally, life does get in the way for students, and it does cause them to drop out or take the W or take the F if it's too late. And I think, I can't think of a bigger barrier, kind of like kick them while you're down type of situation than, something terrible just happened in your life. And then on top of that, the college sends you a letter saying that you're on probation. Next question is from Heather. How do you keep up with responding to text messages and counseling support? Do you have to dedicate more staff and counselors when you move to texting? I think we kind of answered this, but if anybody wants to take another crack at this one.
I'd like to respond to this actually, because I think when Jamie first came to me about texting, first I was worried about our counselors' responses. You're adding one more thing to the many, many things I already have to do. And to be honest, that was the initial, like when she first came to our meeting, that was the first initial reaction a lot of people had. But no, I think that the reality of the program is it actually is freeing up time and making us more available to students in a timely manner. Students, I think you might have touched on this, Jamie, but it's more equitable because students, as you know, don't necessarily want to come to campus for 1 hour to see a counselor, may not be able to come to campus for 1 hour, may not have transportation, it may be expensive to pay for gas. And instead, we're able to reach right out to them and they can reach right back out to us without a delay in time. And so they know their need is going to be met. So no, I actually think it's less resources, not more resources.
And if I could just add to that quickly, I know that we've worked with several departments where we've seen such incredible results for key metrics, things like persistence or, financial aid recipients or things like that, where we've actually had instances in which the administration has granted funding for more staffing in these departments to help fuel these initiatives. So in some ways too, if you're able to, use this resource for really meaningful work, there are also opportunities for expansion. At least that was the case at our college.
Thanks, Jamie. The next question we have, I think I answered this one. So the next question we have is, have you included and served multilingual students, reentry, et cetera, in your outreach?
I can just speak to the software itself. There's actually a really great unique feature about this software where it's almost imagine like an old-fashioned, phone circuit, if you will, where you might be communicating with a student. Let's say you're working on an outreach campaign, and a student responds in Spanish or in German or in a language that, maybe the person working on the conversation doesn't speak. That conversation can be seamlessly transferred to another member of your department that's working on that campaign. And it's something that to the student on the other end of the conversation, it's not apparent to them. To them, it is an uninterrupted conversation. And that's something that we found to be really beneficial because telling someone, can you hold on 1 second? I don't speak your language. That's can be considered a microaggression. It can definitely be very isolating for a student, or otherizing. And so something that we found as a really nice benefit is that a student never has to hear that, at least over text message, where if you have anyone in your department who is bilingual or multilingual, however you normally accommodate for, multilingual students, we're able to facilitate that without any sort of otherization of the student that the student has to experience.
Thank you, Jamie. Just a quick time check with Katie and Darla. Do we have time to answer these 2 questions or, okay, just making sure. The next question I have is from Loris. Outside of changing how you communicate with students and language changes, what would you say the intervention is? i.e., did you build any other resources, plans, interventions, programs, etc., or did the two-way texting just increase the utilization of the service that already exists? Anybody from the team?
So
oh, go ahead.
we didn't really change what we have to offer, but I think Cassie mentioned this earlier that what they did is they facilitated the process. So providing immediate connection to the process and the services we have. Because we know the services are already out there, but students don't necessarily know how to navigate or find them. So they facilitated that process, which meant we didn't have to actually add any additional services. We did have to update some of the things that we had with the appropriate language. Cassie?
Yeah, I was just there. The intervention, I guess, if you think about it, originally was just the letter and then hoping they'd come to us. And so I think Jamie kind of mentioned earlier, the intervention change and implementation was us going to them. So flipping that. And then as Jodi kind of mentioned just now, almost facilitating this immediate assistance where students may come here or call and then come up against another barrier. We don't have anything available to you right now. You have to wait. They didn't have to wait because we were able to not only go to them instead of the other way around, then we were able to just fast pass them, if you will, to get the service they needed. They're not waiting 2 weeks, therefore the registration date didn't pass, therefore they can still get the good classes, rather than just taking what's left over. So I think we did, considering what we had been doing was trying to email and then the letter, switching it to this intervention, it was really successful. In my opinion, it created a lot of good things.
Thank you, Cassie. Let's just take 2 more questions and we'll switch it over to Darla and Katie. So the second to last question from the chat, are there dedicated counselors whose schedules are open specifically for the priority appointments for students in academic notice, or are those appointments for the subject to dismissal? Jodi?
Yeah, so Cassie just alluded to this. So essentially, once we have the student and the student needs an appointment, we're just going to book that appointment. We'll go out in advance if we need to. She said it perfectly, fast pass straight into an appointment. So we don't have to set aside priority appointments or anything specific for those students. As part of the campaign, we're just going to get them in there.
Thanks, Jodi. And then last question from the group chat, how about technologically challenged students?
So I can speak to this. While on our end, we are working with a text message software. It's a website, right? That's one of the beauties of it, is that it's something where you don't have to have anything special installed on your computer or something like that. For students, this is something that they are using their phone for, right? For them, it truly is just a text message conversation, which, I know there was a lot of research done during the pandemic about the accessibility of different modes of communication and technology. And a lot of that alludes to the idea that text message is the most accessible form of communication. So many of our students have greater access to that kind of communication, or even more comfortable with that. But if you're referring to a student who maybe isn't comfortable texting or doesn't have the ability to text, we still, I think it's important to note too that when we're using text message, most of the time, this isn't necessarily replacing other ways to contact, right? So, I mean, a student can always come into the counseling center. They can always send an email. They can always place a phone call. While we're notifying students of their academic standing via this text, that doesn't mean that they didn't receive the email or something like that. So it really is, it's a supplemental form of outreach, as opposed to something that would therefore, prevent access for someone who maybe wasn't able to engage in this way.
Thank you, Jamie and team, and thank you everybody for those fantastic questions. Katie and Darla?
Well, I cannot thank you enough for reaching out to us in the first place, being willing to come and share your knowledge, your experience. Katie and I were talking, kind of behind the scenes, saying we wish that we had the reactions or the emojis in a webinar, because we would have had hearts, we would have been clapping, we would have been using several of those to communicate just how wonderful, just how much we appreciate you coming forward and sharing all of this, and then answering all these really good questions from you all. Thanks for sticking with us. I know we had to have some people drop off at the 1 o'clock hour, but hopefully they'll go back and watch that last half hour of the webinar to get really practical. I think that's what, we're always asking each other, like, do you have an example? How did you do it? What did you do? And so really appreciate you doing that. As we mentioned a few times, just wanted to kind of shout out our colleagues at Academic Senate for the resolution that they passed last spring. And then I actually put the link here. I'm going to put that in the chat for everyone. If you go right to we got this right off of their webpage. So we also appreciate the shout out they gave us first, linking it to our study. And we just, we're not doing this for recognition. We're doing this for the students. And just hearing, if any of you have ever talked to a student on probation, and again, our colleagues from Moorpark shared some of what I heard, the same thing, in talking to students, and that letter and how it feels, and all of those things. And so it's very hopefully encouraging to so many of you out there to know that you do have the power to make some of these changes on your campus. And don't wait for Title V to change. Don't wait for that machinery to move. You can do something for your students right now. So just in closing, I think there's a couple more slides, some QR codes. This is the report for the survey data that we shared at the very beginning. There's also a webinar that we did last week. You can watch that recording where we go into much more depth about all of the findings from not all the findings, the survey was huge. All the findings that are in this report we shared in last week's webinar. We also want to shout out Lumina Foundation, who with their generous support is what helped us be able to do this research on behalf of our students. And I believe our next slide is just a link to, or QR code to the web page for the African American Transfer Tipping Point. And again, it has all the reports and briefs that we've done to this point, the different webinars, the slides. And so we did have a couple of questions in the Q&A about, well, can we get these slides? Will this recording be posted? And so our plan is to send both of those, the recording and the slides, to everyone who registered for today's webinar, and then we will also be posting it on probably this webpage here, and maybe making some announcements, might be on our banner on our first page, things like that. So it will be accessible, for sure. I just want to thank everyone for joining us on our inaugural college spotlight series. We hope to be coming back to you a few times a year at least to really lift up the wonderful work that our colleagues are doing across the state on behalf of students, and trying to really make a difference in not just student success, but the lives and the futures of our students. So we again, thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.